The best of the rest for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this weekend during the NFL Draft. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And this week, we're going to be coming at you on Saturday. We may come at you on Sunday. Lots to talk about with the NFL draft this weekend, but also I'm going to be doing a lot of chatting with my insiders. And if you want to become a Locked On Bucs insider, where you're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message, go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. Join your friends and download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store or Google Play. So, how often do teams hit on their first round picks? That's coming up in a little bit, but first, my goodness, we have talked about a lot of college players over the course of the last month or so. And there's going to be 257 players drafted at the end of this week, and even more that sign as undrafted free agents. So obviously we are not going to talk about all of them leading up to the draft. In fact, it's more likely that more than half of the players that the Bucs draft, we will be talking about for the first time over the weekend and into next week. So I wanted to shine a little spotlight on players that we haven't talked about yet, and players that some of you have been asking for. We're calling it the best of the rest and how I think they would fit with the Buccaneers. So let's start with the highly requested Florida Gator wide receiver, Ricky Pearsall. So Ricky Pearsall is projected to be a day 2 pick and turned plenty of heads with the Gators last season. Pearsall finished with 65 receptions, 965 yards, 4 touchdowns, and a 14.9 yards per reception average, while also carrying the ball for 62 yards and 2 more touchdowns. Now, prior to playing in Gainesville, Pearsall was a starter for Arizona State, shout out David Harrison, where he received all Pac-12 honors in 2021 and was the team's leading receiver. He's got 4.4 speed. He works maniacally at his craft to overcome his lack of physical gifts. He's only 6'1" and 190 pounds. So Pearsall found ways beyond size to become such a viable threat, focusing more on speed, quickness, and an impressive refinery of the route tree, giving him an advantage against smaller size corners or even some corners that are bigger than he is. But that's where my concern comes in. I'm not sure he can utilize those traits as effectively in the NFL as he did with Florida. So Pearsall would still make the perfect wide receiver 3 for the Bucs this season, but I'm not sure he can develop into that wide receiver 2 if Chris Godwin moves on. So it may put the Bucs right back into the wide receiver market again next offseason. And don't get me wrong, I think if the Bucs take Pearsall, he would be a great fit. He would be extremely productive. Liam Cohen would utilize him in some fantastic ways, and that's why he's in my best of the rest. But I think his ceiling at the NFL level might just be a wide receiver 3, or at least that's looking to be what his ceiling would be with the Buccaneers. The next player that I want to talk about is a cornerback, and this is a guy that I've mentioned in passing a few times, but it's time to give him a little bit of shine because he could very well be the pick for the Buccaneers Thursday night, and that is Clemson cornerback Nate Wiggins. I talked a lot about the prototypical Todd Bowles corner in terms of size, and Wiggins fits that to a T. He's a shade over 6'1", 175 pounds. He's a physical corner in a 74-inch wingspan. That really helped him at Clemson in those contested catch situations. But it also, between his arm length and his physicality, it helps him jam at the line of scrimmage and force receivers off their spots. But possibly the most impressive thing about Wiggins is his sub 4.3 speed. And that gives him an advantage. Even when he has to recover, if he's been beat at the line, his closing speed is remarkable and has taken explosive plays away from the offense and turned them into incompletions or explosive plays for the defense. That's something that the Buccaneers desperately need in the secondary. When you think of playmakers in the secondary in terms of guys that will take the ball away or make those splash plays, you hope Jordan Whitehead does that. We believe that he will, but pretty much you have Antoine Winfield Jr. That's it. That's your explosive playmaker in the secondary. Zion McCollum can't catch a cold. Jamel Dean had an opportunity in a divisional round game against the Detroit Lions to do just that, and he dropped the ball, which led to points for the Detroit Lions. But Nate Wiggins coming in could certainly be that takeaway, ball hawk, forced fumble machine. Clemson used Wiggins last year on occasion to get after the quarterback. We also know that Todd Bowles loves to do that. He had a sack, a tackle for loss, 6 pass breakups, 2 interceptions, one of which he took to the house for a touchdown, and 2 forced fumbles. This guy can defend. He can tackle in space. He can contend with big receivers trying to high point the football. He can force takeaways. He might honestly be a better fit in terms of what Bowles typically looks for in a corner over Kool-Aid McKinstry. I still have my reservations about the learning curve of a corner and what they're going to have to go through and what they're going to have to undertake in year one. And one that's drafted that high, you may not see the immediate results early on in the season, but Wiggins is special and his impact will be felt sooner than later if he is indeed the pick for the Buccaneers. I want to jump over into the live chat. Richard says, your equipment sounds better, James. Glad you got it worked out. I'm actually still in the process. Have the new microphone, but my soundboard blew a couple of weeks ago, so I'm having to use my travel soundboard right now until I'm able to get a replacement. But I appreciate that the audio quality is there. David Stacks, Insider David, in the chat says, saw a click of Latu saying he wants to play with JTS. I believe they were teammates at Washington. I also saw that clip that Leatu Latu would love to join Joe Tryon-Shoyinka with the Buccaneers. Well, I'm sure Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, as well as Yaya Diaby and Vita Vea and Kalijah Kancey and Todd Bowles, would love to see Leatu Latu join that Buccaneers defense. We got Joe in the chat. Do you think the Bucs could double dip on wide receiver this year? I like Johnny Wilson. Shout out the chatter that kept bringing him up. And Taj Washington, who is a small day 3 receiver with amazing hands. They could, but I would think that it's unlikely. And the reason I say that, and I'll get into this real quick before we hit the break, what the Bucs are going to look for in terms of a wide receiver in this draft is they need a certified wide receiver 3. Now, I believe that they should look for their wide receiver 3 while finding a guy that could move to wide receiver 2 in case Chris Godwin ends up moving on. But there isn't anybody on day 3 that I think is going to be a big upgrade over a Trey Palmer, over a Devin Tompkins. And you already have those guys on the roster. You're looking for somebody that can bring an outside presence while Liam Cohen moves Chris Godwin back to a primarily slot receiver position. So you need someone with size, speed. Yeah, it doesn't have to be blazing speed, but you need that big size to play on the outside opposite of Mike Evans that brings you something that Trey Palmer and Devin Tompkins don't offer. So I think if you find that guy, it could be an Adonai Mitchell in the first round. It could be Ricky Pearsall in the second. It could be Washington. It could be Johnny Wilson. It could be any of those guys. But you're looking for that upside to move into the wide receiver 2 spot. And I think if you find that guy, well, now you have Evans, Godwin, the rookie, you have Tompkins, you have Palmer, you have kind of your core of wide receivers. And if one of those guys goes down, you're going to have to shuffle things around a little bit. And obviously you hope that doesn't happen. But I don't see wide receiver being the position that they double dip on in this draft. I would think it's more likely the secondary. You might double dip on corner. But the most likely would be either offensive line. You get 2 shots at that, or edge rusher, and you get 2 shots at that. But some later picks that look like they could be a really nice fit for the Buccaneers. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. I cannot begin to tell you how much money I saved by buying my brakes and rotors from eBay Motors for my car, rather than buying them at another shop or just taking them in to be done. eBay Motors was a lifesaver for how much money I saved getting parts for my car. So with all the parts that you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Every day, make sure you are coming back tomorrow. It will be the final episode before the NFL draft. Evan Klosky will be joining me. Yes, I know it's a Wednesday and Evan is not here. He had some Tampa Bay Lightning stuff to take care of. So he is joining the final episode before the NFL draft, and we have some fun coming up for you. We were going to do dueling mock drafts, but instead we've pivoted, and we're going to have ourselves some fun, play a couple of games, make some bold predictions. In the meantime, the Locked On NFL mock draft is available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who the local Locked On experts are picking for every NFL franchise, with live reactions from local college football experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL mock draft available now on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If the Tampa Bay Buccaneers miss out on one of those early offensive linemen, one of the players that I really like is Isaiah Adams out of Illinois. This guy is a mauler, 6'4", 320 pounds. Adams was a 2-year starter at Illinois and transferred after splitting 3 years between Garden City Community College and Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. So, for those of you that only believe that Jason Light takes small school offensive linemen and that's the only thing he ever does ever, there's your small school angle for Isaiah Adams, playing at a community college, playing at a college in Canada before transferring to the University of Illinois. But he also checks off the boxes that Jason Light looks for in his offensive lineman. He played guard and tackle, so he has versatility to move around the line if needed, but he really found his groove along the interior of the offensive line, which is where he projects to play in the NFL. Absolutely great awareness, and he really excelled at Illinois with getting to the second level as a lead blocker, and that was most evident in 2022 when he was blocking for Chase Brown who is now with the Cincinnati Bengals and looks to take on a much bigger role there. He does have a little work to do with his feet, at least to gain more confidence in his footwork. There were times where he would get caught off guard, and while the upper body was really strong, the feet would cause him to get beat and lead to penalties. But that's a fixable issue because it's not a consistent one. Adams projects to be a late day 2 or even a day 3 pick. So this is a player that if the Bucs go, let's say, edge rusher and then wide receiver and then corner and then running back with their first 4 picks, he could be sitting there for them in round 4. Of course, that all depends on the way the board is falling. If there's a run on offensive linemen and he, kind of gets bumped up to go sooner, or if we see some of these offensive linemen starting to fall, so now all of a sudden you're a little more confident that he's going to trickle in to day 3. He could very well end up being their final pick of day 2. And then you have a potential starting guard in the 3rd round of the draft, which would just be an absolute steal. Joe in the chat says, James liking an Illinois product. I wonder why. I don't always like I haven't talked about the Illinois tight end just because I don't think he's going to fit. But, this is a solid player. Truth be told, I was a big fan of Aurelius Ben and was excited when he got drafted, but boy, did he not pan out in the NFL. But a couple of other guys that I want to bring up. Oh, and by the way, the Illinois went on a run. What was it? There were 9 consecutive Super Bowls where an Illinois player was on the winning roster. Just saying. But you all know my stance on running backs. But the Bucs could wait until day 3 to get one, and it may not even be until the 6th round. And someone that would be in that range that I really, really like that fits well is Washington running back Dylan Johnson. His size, 6', 220, is the first thing that jumps out. But then, like some other backs that I have talked about, he checks off the boxes that the Bucs need. He can run with power, and be a short yard monster, but he's solid in pass protection and can catch out of the backfield. He's coming off of a nearly 1,200-yard rushing season with 16 touchdowns, which led his conference, while averaging over 5 yards a carry, then added 24 receptions on 25 targets for another 190 yards. He's not flashy, and he has a ceiling on his athleticism, which makes him kind of the perfect addition for the Buccaneers because he's not a guy that's really going to explode and emerge as an RB1. He's not super speedy. He ran a 4.68 at the combine, but he is the grinder. He is the guy that loves the physicality, that loves getting those tough yards. He does not, go down on early contact. He does not shy away from contact after the first guy hits him. He is the guy that the Buccaneers would turn to on those 3rd or 4th and 1s, the goal line situations, and then late in games to take advantage of a tired defense. He runs with anger. He runs with power, but he's a late day 3 player that complements what the Bucs already have in Rachaad White and Chase Edmonds. And then finally, we've talked about the Bucs improving the pass rush without taking an edge rusher by upgrading the line with a player like Jerzon Newton. On day 2, Michael Hall Jr. out of Ohio State can bring a similar level of play to put on the other side of Vita Vea and opposite of Kalijah Kancey. He was 2-time All Big Ten. He had just 2 sacks last year, but had 22 hurries, and then he had 5 sacks in 2022. His biggest trait is his get off at the snap, which is kind of like Kalijah Kancey. Hall explodes off of the line, and it gives him an immediate advantage as he's generally into his second step by the time the opposing offensive lineman is getting set out of his stance. That quickness allows him to compensate for his lack of size. He's just 6'2", 280 pounds, and I realize I'm saying just, but we're talking about comparing him to other NFL players. In a Todd Bowles defense, he could truly excel as a guy that could line up as a 3-4 end, a 4-3 tackle, or Bowles might even stand him up as an extra blitzer in obvious passing situations. So he's projected to go day 2. And while I'm not sure I would pull the trigger on Michael Hall Jr. in the second round. It kind of depends on what they did in the first round, who else is still sitting there. If he's around to pick 89 or close enough that the Buccaneers can throw in a day 3 or a future pick to move up a couple of spots and go get him, he would be a really, really good addition to this defense. So how's that for, I talked about an Illinois guy, but I also talked about an Ohio State guy, and you all know how I feel about Ohio State. Going to jump in the chat real quick. Robert says Ben had one long pass play with Freeman. That was it, unfortunately. Well, don't forget the bend around that they loved to run back then, where Aurelius Ben would go on those end around reverses, and it was always a disaster. Joe says 2 Illinois picks. James, this isn't playing well into your defense. Joe, I'm not the one that has Jerzon Johnny Newton as the number 1 defensive tackle in this draft, and I'm not the one that mocked him to the Bucs last week. That was Evan Klosky, the Ohio State fan. Also, it's not often that Illinois has good football players, so when I have the opportunity to talk about them, I will. I don't know if you guys remember last year when I was pounding the table for the Bucs to draft either of the twins, Chase Brown or Sidney Brown. They needed a safety. They needed a running back. They took neither. Chase Brown goes to the Bengals, and Sidney Brown ends up with the Philadelphia Eagles, and it just broke my heart into a billion little pieces. But the draft is never, ever, ever a sure thing. I have a cautionary draft tale coming up for you next here on Locked On Bucs. I've been told I'm a competitive person, and I have a competitive side. We all do. And my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. And the best part is messing with my friends. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly, but now I can also heist their vaults of riches for myself. And the leaderboards show me who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can team up with friends and other people from all around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. Wrapping things up here on a Wednesday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast. And something popped up on my Twitter feed this morning that I thought was really interesting and worth talking about. And it goes back to one of my earlier shows in the offseason, probably a couple of my earlier shows. It's something that I've talked about on this show the entire time I have been hosting, especially when people decide to start bashing Jason Light, saying that he can't draft or that Tom Brady's the only reason he had any success or whatever other things that they want to bring up to bash Jason Light. I am a staunch Jason Light defender because I think he's done a really great job. And without Jason Light, there is no Tom Brady. Without Tom Brady, there's no Lombardi. But we can get into that debate on another day. Essentially, what it boils down to is this. The NFL draft is a gamble. Everything about it is a gamble. There is no such thing as a sure thing. And every player that has their name announced over the next 3 days has a chance to be a Hall of Famer or a bust. So Paul Hembo of ESPN put together a list of first-round picks that were hits and misses spanning the years 2000 through 2019. So 20 years of drafts. If a player signed a second contract with a team with the team that drafted them, it's considered a hit. If they didn't, it was considered a miss. Now, of course, there could be hits and misses that could be categorized as the other based on situations. But for the sake of this study, That was his criteria. And here's what Hembo found out. By position, this is what has happened over the first 20 drafts of the 2000s. Centers, 12 of them were drafted, 92% hit rate. That's pretty good. Offensive tackle, 64 of them drafted, 59% hit rate. Guards, 28 of them drafted, 50% hit rate. Linebackers, 50 drafted, 48% hit rate. Quarterbacks, 56 were drafted, 46% hit rate. Edge, 104 of them were drafted, 44% hit rate. Defensive tackles, 60 drafted, 40% hit. Corners, 71 drafted, 38% hit. Running backs, 48 drafted, 38% hit. Safeties, 41 drafted, 34% hit. Tight ends, 24 drafted, 33% hit. And finally, the worst of the bunch, wide receivers, 77 of them drafted, 27% of them hit. In total, you have 635 players taken in the first round from 2000 through 2019, and the overall hit rate is 43%. That means you're more likely to draft a guy that doesn't end up getting a second contract with your team than you will a franchise player. Obviously, centers are the safest, according to this breakdown that Hembo did, but you're looking at less than one center drafted per year. Offensive linemen in general, you have a better than 50% chance that they're going to be with you for a while. After that, the odds are flat out bad. And I point that out to say this. A miss in the first round doesn't make a GM bad. A miss in the first round doesn't make that particular pick bad. And a miss in the first round doesn't make that draft class bad. It just means it didn't work out. We know Jason Light is a day two wizard and has found building block pieces for this franchise on day two and into day three. Missing a first round pick happens more than it doesn't across the league. But teams are picking players based on need, fit, upside, potential, and projection. There's no formula or magic way to determine who is going to be a stud and who is going to be a dud. If there was, these hit rates would be a heck of a lot higher. So when I've talked about draft picks being a coin flip, this is what I mean. I don't say that to make an excuse for anyone or to justify anything. I say it because the data backs it up. And even then, I was giving too much credit to first round picks by saying it was a coin flip, because that would mean that you have a 50-50 chance of whether or not they hit. Turns out you have even less of a chance than a coin flip of getting these first round picks to pan out. So keep that in mind. I know I have talked a lot about the collective. Don't judge a draft based off of the first pick or based off of one particular pick. It's about the collective. And that's why draft grades, while we all do them, they're no different than mock drafts. When you do draft grades right after the draft happens, you are still basing that off of your own personal prediction and projection as to what that player can accomplish. You have to truly grade a draft class, you have to wait for 3 or 4 years to see how these guys are playing. So I saw that chart this morning and I thought those numbers are even worse than I thought they would have been. Offensive linemen, again, you tend to be more safe than other positions, but you are trying to draft based off of your projection and your prediction for how a player is going to perform, how he is going to fit into your scheme. And Jason Light has said he's never missed on a player above the shoulders. You cannot predict how they are going to handle this level of pressure at such a young age. Do they have the maturity? Do they have the mental capability to deal with playing in the NFL? That tends to be where teams miss more often than not. Going to jump into the chat one more time before we get out of here. Destined for greatness says, my 3 draft wishes outside of the first round is either Cooper or Trotter at linebacker and Javon Baker. If we walk away with 2 out of the 3, I'd be happy with that. David Stacks in the chat says, Light was there in New England when Brady was drafted too, ironically. Yep. And then Joe in the chat says, not going to lie, I kind of miss Noah Spence. I thought he was a pretty good player. It's funny, I was talking about that draft class with a Titans-loving buddy of mine yesterday. We were talking about the trade that the Rams made with the Titans to move up to get Jared Goff. And basically out of the haul of draft picks that the Titans got, the only player that panned out was Derrick Henry. It was bad. And so I brought up that draft class where the Bucs got Vernon Hargreaves, Noah Spence, Roberto Aguayo. We're not going to talk about it. This is a happy time. This is NFL Draft Eve. We are not going to discuss that any further. And then Lakita in the chat says, geez, can we just get to camp? We got a ways to go, but you'll have rookie minicamp, voluntary minicamp, all that stuff coming up right after the draft. You are also going to have Evan Klosky coming up on tomorrow's episode. Make sure you check that out. We're going to have some fun. We're going to play some rapid fire games, bold predictions for the draft coming up with Evan on tomorrow's show. In the meantime, check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Follow along on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/Locked On Bucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. Want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.